was a Tuesday morning in late October 2026, the kind of crisp autumn day in Crestwood, Georgia, when the air carried both a chill and the faint scent of burning leaves. By the time the courthouse bell rang at 9 o'clock, the gallery was already full, shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk who had come not only for the law but also for the spectacle. There was something about a trial that felt like theater to them, and today, the stage was Danielle Carter's. Danielle, a 35-year-old black attorney, walked into the room with a steady pace that belied the storm raging beneath the surface. She wore a simple navy suit and carried a plain black tote, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress. She had practiced law in Atlanta for nearly a decade, but this morning she sat at the defense table, not the counsel's chair. The irony did not escape her. Once, she had stood on the other side of this very courtroom fighting for clients who couldn't afford to have their voices silenced. Today, she was the one everyone wanted silenced. The courtroom itself seemed to take a breath as she entered. The old wooden benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk leaning forward to get a better look. The ceiling fans circled lazily, though no one could feel their breeze. The American flag in the corner hung stiff, as though reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Eyes followed Danielle from every direction, some filled with suspicion, others with thinly veiled contempt. You could almost taste the assumption in the air. A black woman accused of corruption must surely be guilty. Behind her, whispers swelled like a rising tide. "She thought she was above the law," someone murmured, and another replied, "They finally caught her." These weren't statements of fact. They were conclusions dressed as common sense, passed down the benches as though truth needed no evidence. In Crestwood, where racial lines were drawn not only on maps but in minds, many had already tried and sentenced Danielle before the judge had even entered. Danielle sat down at the defense table, placing her hands deliberately on the surface. Her fingers tapped once, then went still as if she commanded them. To anyone else, it looked like composure. To her, it was survival. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than words when the world was eager to twist everything you said. She did not bow her head, nor did she glare defiantly. She simply held her posture steady, as if she were listening to a frequency no one else could hear. At precisely 9:15, the heavy wooden door at the back swung open. Judge Harold Whitman, a man in his late 60s with a reputation for stern discipline, entered in his black robe. He didn't slam the gavel. He didn't need to. The room hushed because rooms like this always hushed for men like him. His jaw was tight, his eyes sweeping across the gallery with an authority that came not from wisdom but from years of being obeyed. When his gaze landed on Danielle, the air shifted, almost imperceptibly, half a degree colder. It wasn't hatred exactly, it was dismissal, the kind of dismissal that cuts deeper because it doesn't see you at all. To Judge Whitman, Danielle was not an attorney, not a daughter, not even an individual. She was simply the accused, and worse, a black accused. "Be seated," he said, though no one had been standing. The authority in his tone made the order redundant. The prosecutor, a young white man named Patrick Sloan, shuffled his papers with exaggerated purpose. He was new to the county but had quickly learned how to play to its crowd, confident voice, sharp suits, and a habit of quoting scripture in closing arguments. Today, he wore a navy tie and the smugness of someone who believed his job was already done. Across the aisle, the bailiff shifted, his eyes darting to the black leather tote beside Danielle's chair. He hesitated, then stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Ma'am, your bag," he said. Danielle didn't move. "It's already been cleared," her attorney murmured. But the bailiff kept his palm extended, waiting. The judge arched one brow, and the gallery leaned forward, hungry for even the smallest drama. The bailiff reached toward the tote, his fingers inches away. That's when Danielle spoke for the first time, not loud, not sharp, just final. "This is not for you to touch." The words landed in the courtroom like a blade dropped on stone. A ripple spread across the gallery, throats tightening, whispers catching mid-breath. The bailiff froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. Judge Whitman's head snapped up, his jaw tightening further. Even the prosecutor paused, a paperclip poised uselessly between his fingers. Danielle had not raised her voice, but silence bent around her words as if they carried more weight than volume. Her attorney, a seasoned black lawyer named Marcus Hayes, leaned close and whispered, "You've exercised your right, Danielle." His tone was calm but careful, as though each word risked shattering glass. The judge let the moment uncomfortably long, testing to see if it would snap. Then he flicked his fingers, dismissing the bailiff with a silent command. The officer stepped back, cheeks red with humiliation. It was a small victory, invisible to those who didn't know the stakes. But for Danielle, it was the first boundary she drew. This was not a spectacle for them to paw through. This was her fight, and no one touched what belonged to her. The crowd didn't see it that way. To them, her refusal confirmed their suspicions. "See, she's hiding something," a man whispered from the back row. A woman shook her head knowingly, as if she had predicted it all along. That's the thing about prejudice. It doesn't wait for truth. It takes the shape of whatever makes it feel most comfortable. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "Proceed," he said, his voice like gravel, worn but unyielding. The door at the far end opened once again, and Officer Mark Reynolds strode in. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly pressed blues, he wore his uniform like a crown. His walk carried a kind of swagger, not the friendly kind, but the sort that announces, "I own this room." His grin wasn't wide, it never is with men like him, but it curled at one corner with the confidence of someone who already knew how the story would end. The gallery's attention shifted immediately. Whispers turned to nods, nods to murmurs of approval. They trusted him. He was white. He was an officer, and he was telling them exactly what they wanted to hear before he even opened his mouth. Danielle watched, her gaze steady, her breathing slow. She had faced men like Reynolds before, men who mistook arrogance for authority, who believed their word carried more weight than hers simply because of the uniform they wore. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't the one on the attack. She was the target. Reynolds raised his right hand, swore his oath, and leaned into the microphone with practiced ease. The court reporter's keys clacked a rhythm that sounded like inevitability. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Officer Reynolds," he began, "please describe for the court the circumstances under which you discovered the funds and documents in Miss Carter's vehicle." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Funds, documents, corruption. Those words carried their own gravity. A woman in the second row clicked her tongue in pity. A man whispered, "Knew it." The courtroom was a seesaw tilting under the weight of assumption, and Reynolds had just jumped on the heavy side. But Danielle did not flinch. She sat with her hands pressed flat against the table, her chin level, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. The stillness that radiated from her wasn't surrender, it was readiness. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a reservoir waiting for the right moment. And so, in that small county courthouse on a crisp October morning, the battle lines were drawn in chalk. A judge and an officer on one side, a black woman on the other, and a gallery ready to cheer for whichever side made them feel safest about themselves. They believed they were watching a trial. What they didn't know was that they were standing at the edge of a story that would unravel every certainty they carried in with them. And that is where the first cracks began. In a court not of law, but of prejudice. A court where justice had to fight to even enter the room. As the gavel came down and the testimony began, no one in that gallery realized that the silence they mocked would soon roar louder than all their certainty combined. And that leads us into the next moment, when the officer's performance begins, a show of arrogance and power that would ignite the first sparks of doubt. The first thing you noticed about Officer Mark Reynolds wasn't his uniform, it was the way he wore it. He stepped into the witness box like an actor stepping onto a stage, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to seem untouchable. The dark blue fabric of his jacket hugged his frame, brass buttons gleaming under the fluorescent lights as though polished for this very morning. His shoes clicked against the wood, each step measured, each pause deliberate. This wasn't just testimony, it was theater, and Reynolds had rehearsed his line. The gallery leaned forward as one body, the air heavy with anticipation. For years, Crestwood had treated men like Reynolds as if they were pillars of truth. His badge was more than a piece of metal. It was a shield against doubt, and today, that shield gleamed brighter than ever. He adjusted the microphone with casual authority, glanced at the prosecutor with a look of shared understanding, and then turned his gaze toward the audience. It was not the gaze of a man being questioned. It was the gaze of a man delivering a sermon. "Officer Reynolds," the prosecutor began, his voice carrying confidence. "Can you tell us what led you to investigate Miss Carter's vehicle?" Reynolds cleared his throat, leaned in slightly, and let his words unfurl with the practiced cadence of a storyteller, who knew his audience was already on his side. At approximately 9:15, he said, I received a confidential tip linking a vehicle to illegal cash transfers. At 9:20, I initiated a lawful stop of Miss Carter's car. Upon questioning, her responses were evasive. Probable cause allowed me to proceed with a search. That's when I discovered the funds and documents. The words funds and documents hung in the air like heavy stones, dropping into the collective consciousness of the gallery. People murmured, their certainty hardening. You could see it on their faces, the small nods, the satisfied smirks. In their minds, the trial was over. Who could argue with an officer's sworn testimony? Who could argue with neat stacks of cash and folders full of incriminating pages? Reynolds knew this. He let the pause linger, let the weight of his words sink in before continuing. He gestured toward the evidence box at his side, his gloved hand lifting two items with deliberate grace: a clear plastic bag filled with bundles of cash and a thin manila folder. He held them high, not for the judge, not for the lawyers, but for the gallery. He wanted the crowd to see. He wanted them to believe. Gasps rippled through the benches. Someone exhaled sharply through their nose, the sound of smug satisfaction. A woman clicked her tongue. To them, it was confirmation, visual proof of what they had already decided in their hearts. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, standing tall, the state moves to admit Exhibit A, currency recovered from the defendant's vehicle, and Exhibit B, financial documents suggesting illicit payments. The clerk, wearing latex gloves, stepped forward. She took the bag and folder carefully, as though handling sacred relics, labeling them with tags that clicked like buckles being fastened. The judge nodded once, barely looking at the evidence, his approval almost mechanical. Motion granted. For the gallery, it was a victory. For Reynolds, it was triumph. And for Danielle, it was the tightening of a noose, woven not of rope, but of presumption. She didn't glance at the money. She didn't even blink when the folder was raised as if it were the final word on her life. She sat perfectly still, her right hand closing around her left wrist beneath the table, holding herself steady as the room tilted against her. Reynolds continued, his voice smooth, confident, each sentence crafted to sound like gospel truth. The documents, he explained, are payment schedules, names redacted, of course, for protection. But the totals speak volumes: bribery, fraud, obstruction of justice. He counted the charges on his fingers, looking to the gallery like a teacher reciting a simple lesson. There is no innocent explanation for what I found. The prosecutor nodded in rhythm, as though the two were choreographing a dance. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, his expression approving, his gaze saying, "Keep going, son. You're doing fine." And the gallery? They drank it in. People leaned closer to one another, whispering in delight. Some smiled openly. For them, Reynolds wasn't just presenting evidence, he was reinforcing what they already believed, that a black woman, especially one who dared to rise as an attorney, couldn't possibly be clean. It was racism wrapped in procedure, prejudice hidden behind paperwork, and Reynolds played his part perfectly. But if you watched closely, if you looked beyond the swagger and the props, you could see the cracks forming, the pause before he said, redacted, the way his smile stiffened when he repeated, probable cause. The slight raise of his eyebrows as if even he couldn't quite believe how easy this performance felt. Danielle saw it. She didn't need to interrupt, didn't need to protest. She simply observed, her silence like a steady heartbeat against the noise. While the crowd leaned on Reynolds's words, she leaned on the truth she carried, hidden for now but sharp enough to cut when the moment came. Reynolds's performance reached its peak when he turned toward the defense table. He didn't address Danielle directly, not at first. Instead, he allowed his eyes to flicker toward her, quick, sharp, like a cat glancing at prey behind a cage. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed. "Yes," he said, his grin curling wider. "The person I recovered this evidence from is right there, Miss Danielle Carter." The room erupted. A wave of whispers, gasps, and a few chuckles. The finger was small, but it carried the weight of accusation heavier than any folder or bag of cash. In that instant, Danielle was no longer a respected attorney, no longer a citizen with rights. In the eyes of the gallery, she was reduced to a caricature, a black defendant whose guilt was a formality. Judge Whitman didn't smile, but his silence was its own verdict. "You disgrace this court just by sitting here," he said at last, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The words were not law. They were weather. And just like that, the temperature in the room dropped again. Danielle did not flinch. Her hands tightened, yes, but her eyes remained steady. Her silence did not break, because Danielle knew something the others did not. She knew that arrogance, no matter how polished, eventually trips on its own shoelaces. And Reynolds, for all his swagger, had just set himself up for a fall. That morning, the crowd thought they were watching the collapse of a black woman's dignity. What they didn't realize was that they were witnessing the slow unraveling of a white officer's facade. And so, the officer's performance ended not with applause, but with a room full of people certain they had seen the truth, when in reality, they had only seen a show. As the gavel tapped once more, sealing the exhibits into record, Danielle sat quietly, her silence humming like a storm beneath still waters. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to defend herself yet. She only needed to wait, because the first crack was coming soon. And when it arrived, the noise of Reynolds's performance would crumble beneath the weight of one simple question. That is where the story turns, moving us from spectacle to fracture, from arrogance to doubt. And it begins with the timeline. Silence is a strange thing in an American courtroom. It can be heavy, awkward, even unsettling. But on that October morning in Crestwood, Georgia, Danielle Carter's silence was something else entirely. It wasn't the silence of fear or defeat. It was sharp, deliberate, like a blade wrapped in velvet. Every moment she chose not to speak, the room seemed to listen harder, straining to hear something beneath the quiet. After Officer Reynolds's performance, after the folder and the money had been paraded like trophies, all eyes turned back to Danielle. The gallery wanted her to break. They wanted to see her flinch, cry, shout, anything that would confirm the narrative already humming in their minds. That's what people expect of a defendant: visible cracks, frantic explanations, desperate protests. But Danielle gave them nothing. She sat still, her hands folded on the table, her gaze steady, her shoulders squared as though holding up a weight no one else could see. To the untrained eye, it looked calm. But to those watching closely, it carried the tension of a bowstring pulled taut. Judge Harold Whitman shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He had just called her a disgrace, and yet here she was, unmoved, unbowed. For men like him, used to dominance being immediate and unquestioned, that kind of composure felt like defiance. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice scraping against the wood-paneled walls, "you will conduct yourself properly. This court will not indulge in arrogance." Esmol. Still, Danielle did not speak. She blinked once, twice, then lowered her eyes to the table, as if acknowledging his words but not yielding to them. Her attorney, Marcus Hayes, placed a hand on her arm and whispered something we couldn't hear. She nodded once, slow, deliberate, but she did not open her mouth. And in that refusal, something remarkable happened. The noise of the courtroom, the whispers, the creaks, the breaths began to turn inward. People leaned closer, waiting. The silence had drawn them in, hooked them against their will. Danielle's quiet presence unsettled them, far more than any outburst could have. Officer Reynolds smirked from the stand. To him, her silence was proof of guilt. "See?" his grin seemed to say. "She's got nothing." But Reynolds misunderstood what he was witnessing. He mistook silence for surrender when, in truth, it was a strategy. Danielle knew the power of letting arrogance fill the room until it choked itself. Then came the moment that sliced through everything. The bailiff, still red-faced from earlier humiliation, edged closer to her again. His eyes flickered toward her tote bag, lying by her chair. Maybe he wanted redemption. Maybe he wanted to prove he still had control. Whatever the reason, his hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the bag. Danielle didn't look up. She didn't move. But when she spoke, her voice cut clean through the thick air. "This is not for you to touch." Ugh. The gallery gasped as one. It wasn't the words themselves, they were simple, almost mundane. It was the way she said them, flat, final. A door slammed shut, with no chance of reopening. Her tone carried authority that didn't belong to a defendant, but to someone who had commanded rooms before. The bailiff froze. Judge Whitman's jaw clenched. Even the prosecutor's pen stilled mid-scratch. And just like that, the balance of the room shifted. People didn't know what to do with it. Some frowned, whispering, arrogant. Others glanced nervously at each other, uncertain why 3 plain words had unsettled them so deeply. The truth is, they weren't used to seeing a black woman draw boundaries in a place designed to strip her of them. That moment, small as it was, cracked the script wide open. Danielle returned to her stillness. Her hand tapped once on the table, then stopped, as though she had given her own order and obeyed it. Her silence roared louder than Reynolds' rehearsed lines. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just hold back, it pushes back. I watched Reynolds shift in his chair, his swagger dimmed for a heartbeat, his smirk faltering. He covered it quickly with another grin, but the crack was there. For the first time, he looked not like a man in control, but like a man confronted with something he didn't understand. The judge cleared his throat, a sound meant to restore order but sounding more like a man clearing doubt from his own chest. "Proceed," he muttered, waving for the prosecutor to continue. But the silence Danielle left behind lingered, stretching thin threads of tension across the room. The prosecutor tried to break it. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "in your professional opinion, is there any innocent explanation for these funds and documents?" "No," Reynolds answered quickly, seizing the opportunity to reclaim the floor. His voice boomed, confident again. "Not when you know what you're looking at." But it didn't land the way it had before. His certainty echoed against Danielle's silence, and for some, it rang hollow. That's the thing about silence, it changes the way noise sounds. What once seemed solid now seemed exaggerated. What once felt like authority now looked like arrogance. Danielle hadn't uttered a speech, hadn't raised her voice, but she had managed to tilt the room in her favor with nothing more than restraint. And then it happened. The prosecutor, eager to keep the momentum, pressed Reynolds to walk the court through his timeline. "At 9:15, Reynolds began smoothly, "I was at the storage lot confirming the confidential tip. By 9:20, I initiated the stop on Miss Carter's vehicle. At 9:30, the evidence was secured. It was clean, too clean, and Danielle knew it. For the first time since the trial began, she shifted in her chair. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Every eye in the gallery followed her. She didn't hurry. She didn't glare. She simply stood, adjusting her jacket, placing her palms gently on the table as if grounding herself. "Officer Reynolds," she said calmly, her voice steady as a level beam of light, "are you telling this court that you were at the storage lot at 9:15 and initiated a stop on my vehicle at 9:20? "Yes," Reynolds replied confidently, unaware of the trap snapping beneath his feet. Danielle tilted her head slightly, almost with pity. "So, you were in two places at the same time." The silence that followed was deafening. The gallery erupted into whispers, heads turning, frowns forming. People began doing the math in their heads, realizing it didn't add up. For the first time, certainty cracked. Reynolds blinked, his composure faltering. I was moving quickly between the sites," he stammered. "That's what I meant." But the damage was done. The silence had cut through his performance, exposing the flaw. Danielle didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. One calm question had turned his show into rubble. And in that moment, I realized what we were really watching. Not just a trial, not just a performance. We were watching silence carve open lies, exposing the noise for what it was: empty, brittle, fragile. The court wasn't ready to admit it yet. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, accusing Danielle of playing word games. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase what we had all just heard, the sound of truth slipping into the cracks of arrogance. And as Danielle sat back down, hands folded once more, her silence hummed with power. It wasn't surrender. It was a strategy. It was survival. It was the quiet defiance of a woman who knew that the first stumble of lies is always loudest when met with silence. And that silence was about to tear the script apart. Because next would come the mask slipping, the moment arrogance turned to anger, and prejudice revealed itself in the rawest words. The thing about lies is that they rarely collapse in one dramatic explosion. More often, they fracture quietly at first, almost invisibly, until the pressure builds and the whole structure gives way. On that October morning in Crestwood, Georgia, the fracture came in the shape of time itself. Officer Reynolds had delivered his testimony with the confidence of a man reciting from a script. 9:15 at the storage lot. 9:20, the stop on Danielle Carter's vehicle. 9:30, evidence secured. Smooth. Precise. Too precise. The gallery heard it and nodded. They wanted neatness, a tidy narrative that confirmed what they already believed. But Danielle heard something else. She heard the impossible math. She heard the arrogance of a man who never expected his story to be questioned. And in that arrogance, he slipped. When Danielle rose from her chair, the room shifted. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She stood with the calm of someone who knew her moment had arrived. Her suit, plain navy, caught the light just enough to remind the room that she was not a caricature but a professional, a lawyer who had fought for justice before many of the people in that gallery had ever set foot in a courtroom. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "are you telling this court that you were at the storage lot at 9:15 and that by 9:20 you had already stopped my vehicle?" "Yes," Reynolds answered without hesitation, too sure of his performance to hear the trap beneath his feet. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not mocking, not smirking, but almost sorrowful. "So you were in two places at the same time?" The silence that followed was electric. It wasn't the silence of boredom anymore. It was the silence of realization. The gallery shifted, whispers swelling like a wave. People frowned, looked at one another, and ran the math in their minds. 5 minutes. 2 locations. Impossible. I could hear someone behind me mutter, "That doesn't make sense." Another voice, sharper, replied, "Maybe he misspoke." But the doubt was there now, spreading like cracks in glass. Reynolds blinked. His hand gripped the edge of the witness stand, knuckles whitening. For the first time all morning, his swagger faltered. He cleared his throat. "I was moving quickly between the sites," he said, his words stumbling over one another. "That's what I meant." But it was too late. The neat narrative he had built was unraveling. The gallery had seen the stumble, and once people see a stumble, they start looking for more. Judge Whitman slammed his gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom. "Order," he barked, his face flushed, his glare fixed on Danielle. "This court will not indulge in word games, Miss Carter. Stick to procedure." Word games, that's what he called it. But we knew better. It wasn't a game. It was the sound of truth pressing against a fragile lie. And the judge's anger, whether he admitted it or not, was born from fear not of Danielle, but of what her calm precision had exposed. Reynolds tried to recover, leaning back into the microphone. "It was a misstatement," he said quickly. "First the lot, then the vehicle. That's the order." He forced a smile, trying to reclaim his rhythm, but the stumble lingered in the air like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Danielle didn't push further. She didn't need to. She returned to her chair, sat down slowly, and folded her hands once more. Her eyes never left Reynolds, but her expression gave nothing away. No triumph, no smugness, just the steady gaze of someone who knew she had planted a seed that would grow whether the court wanted it to or not. The gallery was buzzing now. A woman in the front row whispered to her companion, "It doesn't add up." A man across the aisle shook his head, muttering, "If he lied about that, what else is he lying about?" These weren't declarations of innocence yet, but they were cracks, and cracks spread. The prosecutor jumped in, desperate to patch the hole. "Officer, based on your training, would you agree that times can overlap when reports are written after the fact?" Reynolds seized on the lifeline. "Exactly," he said, nodding vigorously. "It's a clerical overlap. What matters is the evidence." The judge nodded quickly too, almost too quickly, as though eager to seal the fissure before it widened. "Very well, let's proceed." But the air had already changed. You could feel it. The certainty that had filled the room earlier now wavered, its edges fraying. Danielle's calm question had done more damage than 100 shouted protests could have. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply laid her palms flat on the table, steady as stone. But there was a spark in her eyes now, a spark that told me she knew what the rest of the room was beginning to suspect. That arrogance had tripped on its own shoelaces. And then she spoke again, not loud, not sharp, but with the weight of something undeniable. "Truth doesn't rush," she said softly. "Lies always stumble first." The words hit the room like a verdict. The gallery froze. Papers stopped shuffling. Even the clock on the back wall seemed to pause. It wasn't a speech. It was a scalpel, cutting clean and leaving silence in its wake. Reynolds's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. He gripped the railing, his knuckles straining. For a moment, his composure cracked wide open, and what poured out wasn't confidence, it was anger. "You women don't belong here," he spat, his voice breaking through the silence like a whip. The gallery gasped. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others, emboldened by prejudice, chuckled softly. But everyone felt the shift. The mask was gone. Reynolds had revealed himself, not as an officer defending justice, but as a man protecting his pride. Judge Whitman slammed his gavel again. "Order!" he roared, though even he looked unsettled. His authority, so solid minutes before, now wavered in the face of Reynolds's outburst. Danielle didn't rise to meet the insult. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply sat there, still, silent, her composure making his anger look small. Her dignity, hard-won and heavy, dwarfed his rage. And that was the crack widening, the fracture deepening. What began as a slip in the timeline had now exposed the rot beneath. Reynolds wasn't just sloppy. He was biased. He was careless with the truth because he thought no one would dare question him. And Danielle, with nothing but silence and a single question, had pulled the mask off for everyone to see. The gallery couldn't unsee it. The prosecutor couldn't patch it. The judge couldn't command it back into hiding. The crack was there now, and it would only grow. Because once prejudice shows its face, you can't forget it. You can't excuse it. You can only decide what you'll do when the mask slips. That morning, in that small Georgia courtroom, the timeline had betrayed the officer, and the silence of a black woman, scorned and underestimated, had become the sharpest weapon in the room. And this was only the beginning, because next would come the mask fully slipping the moment arrogance turned into a raw, undeniable prejudice that no one in the gallery could ignore. Arrogance has a way of hiding behind polished shoes and crisp uniforms, but it cannot hide forever. When the pressure builds, when the lies begin to strain under the weight of truth, arrogance slips. And when it slips, it reveals something raw, something ugly that was always there beneath the surface. That's what happened to Officer Mark Reynolds on that October morning in Crestwood, Georgia. For nearly an hour, he had stood tall in his uniform, playing the role of the untouchable lawman. The gallery had believed him, the judge had nodded along, and the prosecutor had smiled with confidence. But one question, one calm, measured question from Danielle Carter, had cracked the veneer. "So you were in two places at once?" she had asked, and the room had tilted. Reynolds tried to recover, but recovery requires composure, and composure requires humility. Reynolds had none. What he had instead was pride, a dangerous pride, that would not allow him to admit even the smallest misstep. He forced a smile. He muttered about clerical overlap, but the gallery had seen the stumble, and once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. That's when Danielle delivered the line that sealed his unraveling, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Truth doesn't rush. Lies always stumble first." The silence that followed was thick, sacred even, like the pause after a preacher's final word in church. And then Reynolds broke it, not with reason, not with explanation, but with rage. "You women don't belong here," he snapped, his voice cracking through the stillness like a whip. His face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly the veins on his arms bulged. The gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the room. A few chuckled nervously, the kind of laughter that isn't joy but permission, the sound of people emboldened by someone else's prejudice. But most shifted uncomfortably on the benches. A woman in the front row shook her head sharply, disgust flashing in her eyes. A man in the back muttered, "That's too far," though he kept his voice low, as if afraid to stand fully against the tide. Judge Harold Whitman slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" he barked. His tone was stern, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of unease. He had allowed Reynolds to dominate the room, to build his story unchecked. And now that same officer had revealed himself not as a protector of justice, but as a man drunk on pride and prejudice. Reynolds tried to gather himself, but anger doesn't retreat once it's loosed. He leaned forward, pointing a finger at Danielle. "She's mocking this court, playing games while the evidence is right there in front of you." His voice rose with each word, cracking at the edges, raw and uncontrolled. But Danielle didn't rise. She didn't shout back. She didn't even flinch. She simply sat, her posture calm, her silence steady, her hands folded neatly on the table. Her stillness made his rage look smaller by comparison. And in that moment, the contrast became undeniable. On one side, a white officer in uniform, red-faced, shouting, his pride laid bare. On the other hand, A black woman accused of crimes she did not commit, sitting in silence, her dignity unshaken. It was as if the entire history of America's racial injustice had been distilled into that single tableau, power shouting, prejudice pointing, and truth holding its ground without a sound. The gallery felt it. You could see it in their faces, the shift, the recognition. Some still clung to their certainty, muttering, "She's guilty," but others were no longer so sure. Doubt had crept in, and once doubt enters, it spreads like fire through dry grass. Reynolds realized too late what he had done. He tried to retreat, clearing his throat, adjusting his tie, forcing his voice into something calmer. "What I meant," he stammered, "was that she's obstructing, delaying, making a mockery of these proceedings. But the damage was done. You can't unring a bell. You can't unsay words that expose your heart." And what Reynolds had exposed was not professionalism, not integrity, but prejudice. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to restore his own authority. "Officer Reynolds, control yourself," he said, his tone sharp, but the reprimand rang hollow. He had allowed Reynolds to carry the courtroom, and now he struggled to leash the very anger he had empowered. The prosecutor, Patrick Sloan, shifted uneasily in his seat. He tapped his pen nervously, his earlier confidence draining away. He had wanted Reynolds to be his star witness, the cornerstone of the state's case. But now that the cornerstone was cracking in front of everyone, and Danielle, she remained the eye of the storm. Her silence was no longer just unsettling, it was powerful. She didn't need to defend herself against Reynolds's outburst. His words condemned him more loudly than anything she could have said. I sat there, watching, and I realized what we were all witnessing: the mask slipping, the polished shoes, the pressed uniform, the tidy testimony. All of it had been a costume, and beneath the costume was a man whose prejudice ran so deep that a single challenge to his authority unleashed his fury. This was no longer about evidence. This was about pride, about a white officer who believed that pointing his finger at a black woman was enough to make the world nod in agreement, about a judge who had allowed bias to guide his tone, about a gallery of townsfolk who came to be entertained by the downfall of someone they had decided not to trust. But now, the entertainment had soured. What they had witnessed was ugly, and ugliness, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Reynolds slumped back in his chair, his chest heaving. The flush on his face had deepened, spreading down his neck. He tried to look composed, but his anger betrayed him. His hand trembled as he adjusted his tie, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheeks quivered. And Danielle? She lifted her chin ever so slightly, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't gloating. It was recognition, the kind of recognition that says, "I see you. I see what you really are." The silence returned, heavier than before. No one dared break it. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the gallery. It pressed down on the room, demanding acknowledgement. And in that silence, the truth stood naked. This wasn't the story they thought they were watching. This wasn't about a corrupt black attorney caught red-handed. This was about an officer whose arrogance had led him to lie, and whose prejudice had led him to reveal himself. The mask had slipped, and once it slipped, it could not be put back on. The judge finally cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "We will proceed," he said, though it sounded less like authority and more like a plea for normalcy. But there would be no normalcy now, not after what we had just seen, because the courtroom had changed. The gallery had changed. And even though Reynolds still sat in his uniform, the authority he carried into that room had evaporated. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He wasn't believable anymore. He was exposed. And Danielle Carter, sitting in silence, had not lifted a single piece of evidence, had not given a single speech. She had simply waited, and in waiting, she had allowed prejudice to reveal itself. The story wasn't over. The fight wasn't finished. But the tide had shifted. And the next turn would come not from Danielle, not even from Reynolds, but from someone unexpected, from a voice long forgotten, a witness no one thought would return. A woman named Angela Moore, stepping out of the shadows of her own past, is ready to speak the truth. Every trial has its rhythms, the rise and fall of testimony, the sharp crack of the gavel, the endless shuffle of papers. But sometimes, in the middle of that routine, a voice enters the room that no one expected. And when it does, everything changes. That morning in Crestwood, Georgia, after Officer Reynolds's mask had slipped, The courtroom was restless. The gallery buzzed with whispers, some nervous, some gleeful. The prosecutor fumbled with his notes, trying to stitch his case back together. Judge Whitman straightened in his chair, his jaw tight, as though his authority could be restored simply by the way he, Saturday, and Reynolds, red-faced, still seething, shifted in his seat, glaring at Danielle as if her silence had personally betrayed him. Then the bailiff called a name that seemed to hang in the air like a forgotten melody. Angela Moore. The gallery stirred. Some frowned, confused. Others shrugged, unfamiliar with the name. To most of the townsfolk crammed into that wooden room, Angela Moore was nobody. But to Danielle Carter, the name was a chord struck deep in memory. The door creaked open, and a woman in her early 50s stepped inside. She wasn't dressed for a spectacle. No tailored suit, no expensive jewelry. Just a plain brown dress, a faded purse clutched tightly in her hands, and eyes that carried both fear and fire. Her steps were hesitant at first, the way someone walks when they know they're stepping into a storm. But there was something in her face, a resolve, a determination that grew stronger with each step toward the witness stand. Angela Moore had not been called by the prosecution. She wasn't on their list, wasn't part of their tidy script. She was there because she had insisted, again and again, until someone finally relented. She was there because silence had once cost her too much, and she refused to let it cost her again. The bailiff held out the Bible. Angela's hands trembled as she placed her palm upon it, her voice quivering as she swore to tell the truth. She glanced toward Danielle, and for a fleeting moment, the fear in her eyes softened. There was recognition there, two women bound by a past moment of justice. Years ago, Angela had been on the verge of losing everything. A predatory landlord, a fabricated debt, a courtroom stacked against her. She had stood alone until a young attorney named Danielle Carter had chosen to stand with her. Against the odds, against the sneers of those who said, "Why bother?" Danielle had forced the truth into daylight. Angela had kept her home, but more than that, she had kept her dignity. That memory was carved into her bones, and now, with Danielle sitting accused, Angela had come to return the debt. The defense attorney, Marcus Hayes, stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Moore, do you have something to present to the court?" Angela nodded, fumbling with the zipper of her purse. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it, but she caught herself, clutching the strap like armor. At last, she pulled out a small USB drive, holding it as though it might burn her. She passed it to the clerk, her eyes never leaving the floor. It's from a security camera," she said, her voice breaking on the first word. "Near the storage lot. It shows Officer Reynolds near Miss Carter's car, before he claimed to search it." The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, heads whipping around. Some muttered, "Impossible." Others hissed, "What's she doing?" But everyone leaned forward as the clerk plugged the drive into the monitor. The screen flickered to life. Grainy, gray footage filled the room. The angle was poor, the image shaky, but it was clear enough. A timestamp blinked in the corner, 9:10 a.m. 5 minutes before Reynolds claimed he had even received the tip. And there he was, Mark Reynolds, circling Danielle's vehicle, bending down near the driver's side door. The gallery exploded into noise. "Look at that!" someone shouted. "He was there before!" Another voice cried. "He's planting something!" Reynolds shot to his feet, his chair skidding back with a screech. "This is a setup!" he roared, his voice ragged with fury. He jabbed a finger at Danielle, then at Angela. "They're working together. She planted that. This woman's lying." "End." Judge Whitman slammed his gavel, his voice straining for control. "Officer Reynolds, sit down!" But the command lacked bite. Even he couldn't ignore what was playing out on the screen. Angela clutched the railing of the witness stand, her breath ragged, tears streaking her cheeks. She shook her head violently. "I'm not lying," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the noise. "I saw the truth once, and I stayed silent. I won't stay silent again, not when a woman like her is being crushed under the same lies that almost destroyed me." The words silenced the room. Even the whispers died. Angela's voice wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, untrained, but it carried the weight of lived experience. Danielle's eyes softened for the first time since the trial began. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, but her gaze met Angela's, and in that moment, two women who had both carried scars of injustice recognized one another. The gallery shifted uneasily. For some, Angela's words cracked open something uncomfortable, an admission that perhaps the system wasn't as infallible as they'd believed. For others, it was a rallying cry, proof that the officer's story was unraveling. Reynolds, his face a blotchy red, pointed again. "This is outrageous. She's fabricating evidence." His voice broke, his composure gone. He looked less like a protector of the law and more like a cornered man thrashing against the inevitable. Judge Whitman rubbed his temple, his hand trembling slightly. He looked from Angela to the footage to Reynolds, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He tried to bury it, tried to keep his authority intact, but the gallery had already seen it. The judge wasn't so sure anymore. Angela leaned closer to the microphone, her voice quivering but clear. "I may not be strong, but the Truth Island?" The words landed like a bell tolling in a quiet church. Clear, resonant, unforgettable. The gallery hushed. An elderly man in the front row wiped his eyes. A woman whispered, "She's right." The air shifted. Prejudice no longer felt like certainty. It felt like shame. Danielle sat straighter, her silence no longer lonely but joined by Angela's trembling courage. And for the first time, the scales in that room looked as though they might tilt toward justice. It was not the end. The fight was not over. But Angela Moore, a forgotten witness, had just reminded everyone that truth doesn't need polish. It doesn't need power. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it. And her voice was the spark that would ignite the fire to come. Because what followed would not just be a crack in the story, it would be a collapse. And the collapse would come when Reynolds, desperate to hold on to the mask he'd already lost, would unravel completely. Swagger only works when people believe in it. A crisp uniform, a crooked smile, a steady voice, all of it depends on the illusion that the man behind it deserves the authority he wears. But when that illusion cracks, swagger collapses fast. And that is what we watched happen to Officer Mark Reynolds in the Crestwood courtroom. For most of the morning, Reynolds had strutted with the ease of a man who believed he owned the room. His grin curled at the corners like a cat's. His words poured smoothly and confidently. He raised his hand to the gallery as if they were an audience come to applaud. And they had applauded, in their way with nods, smirks, approving whispers. But arrogance has a way of piling too high. One stumble, one moment of truth, and the tower topples. Angela Moore's testimony had been the shove. A shaky woman in a plain dress, holding nothing but a cheap USB drive, had done what all of Danielle's silence and all of Reynolds's arrogance could not. She forced the room to see. The footage was grainy, the angle poor, but it was enough. Enough to show Reynolds near Danielle's car before he ever claimed to search it. Enough to stain the neat story he had told with suspicion that wouldn't wash out. Reynolds didn't crumble quietly. Men like him rarely do. They fight, clawing at the walls of their own unraveling. He stood up, red-faced, jabbing his finger toward Danielle and Angela, his voice breaking. "This is a setup," he shouted. "She planted it. They're working together to destroy me." But the gallery no longer nodded along. They leaned back instead, their expressions wary. Some frowned openly. Others whispered to their neighbors with the uneasy tones of people who had once believed and now weren't so sure. Swagger had turned into panic, and panic is contagious. Judge Harold Whitman slammed his gavel. "Officer Reynolds, sit down," he barked. But his command didn't carry the same weight as before. It sounded more like desperation than authority. The judge himself looked shaken, his jaw tight, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. He rubbed the bridge as though the pressure of the moment had left a mark. Reynolds finally sat, his chest heaving, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. He tried to force his grin back into place, but it came out twisted, broken at the edges. His voice, when he spoke again, trembled. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, almost pleading now. "Cash is cash. Documents are documents." But no one in that room heard strength in his words. They heard fear. Danielle sat steady at the defense table, her palms flat, her eyes forward. She hadn't spoken since Angela's testimony. She didn't need to. Her silence had already done its work, and Angela's voice had carried it further. Now, every twitch of Reynolds's jaw, every stumble of his words, was being measured against Danielle's composure, and in that comparison, he was shrinking. The prosecutor, Patrick Sloan, tried to intervene. "Officer," he said, his tone hurried, "based on your training, do you believe this video is conclusive of wrongdoing?" Reynolds seized the lifeline. "No," he said firmly, too firmly. "It doesn't prove anything. It's misleading, taken out of context." But his voice cracked on the word misleading. It wavered, just enough for the gallery to hear, just enough for the seed of doubt to grow. A woman in the front row whispered to her husband, "He sounds scared." A man in the back shook his head, muttering, "Doesn't look good." The tide was shifting, one whisper at a time. Reynolds' swagger had collapsed, but he kept clawing at its remains. He leaned forward, pounding the witness stand with his palm. "I've served this county for 20 years, he barked. "I've put criminals behind bars, and now you're going to believe some nobody with a shaky video?" Angela flinched at his words, but didn't retreat. She sat taller, her chin lifted, her voice quiet but steady. "I may be nobody to you," she said, "but I know the truth when I see it, and so does everyone else in this room." Her words cut deeper than any lawyer's argument. The gallery murmured, heads turning, eyes narrowing at Reynolds. Suddenly, he wasn't the hero in uniform. He was the man shouting down a trembling woman who had nothing to gain by being there except the hope of justice. Judge Whitman banged his gavel again, his voice sharp. "Enough. This court will not devolve into chaos." But even his tone betrayed him. His earlier certainty had vanished, replaced by the unease of a man realizing he had let arrogance run too far. Danielle's attorney, Marcus Hayes, rose quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply asked one question. "Officer Reynolds, can you explain why you were near Miss Carter's car before you claimed to have received the tip?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the judge, then at the gallery. His lips moved, but no words came. For the first time that day, the man who had filled the room with noise found himself speechless. And in that silence, the courtroom shifted again. The swagger was gone. The mask was gone. All that remained was a man exposed, his authority crumbling, his prejudice laid bare. The gallery leaned forward, their whispers no longer in his favor. "He can't answer," someone muttered. "He's cornered," said another. You could feel it, the shift from certainty to suspicion, from blind trust to open doubt. Reynolds's collapse wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow unraveling of a man who had relied too long on arrogance and prejudice to carry him. His shoulders slumped, his jaw worked silently, and his eyes darted nervously. The swagger that had once owned the room had dissolved into desperation. Danielle sat still, her silence holding more power than his shouts ever could. She didn't need to celebrate. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was doing the work for her. And that truth was about to get louder. Because the next moment wouldn't come from Reynolds's mouth. It would come from something small, something unexpected, that would change the story entirely. A slip of leather, a glint of gold, a badge that would fall to the floor and reveal who Danielle Carter really was. The courtroom thought they had seen the collapse of a man. They hadn't yet realized they were about to witness the rise of a woman. Every story has its turning point, the moment when the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, refuses to stay buried. For Danielle Carter, that moment came not with a speech, not with evidence, but with something small and accidental. It happened quickly, so quickly that for a heartbeat no one understood what they were seeing. Danielle had leaned down to gather a folder from the table. The leather edge snagged against the wood, and as she straightened, something slipped free and skittered across the floor. A tiny sound, plastic against hardwood, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. The gallery shifted, craning their necks. The object came to rest by the leg of her chair, catching the light in just the right way. Gold and blue, unmistakable even in the dull wash of the courtroom lamps. A badge, not the kind pinned to a small-town officer's uniform, not the kind bought at a novelty shop. This was different, federal, official, carrying an authority deeper than any words spoken in that room. The air froze, literally froze. The gallery went silent. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the judge leaned forward, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he squinted to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. For a long moment, no one breathed. And then, like a tide rolling in, the whispers began. "Is that? It can't be. CIA?" The word hissed through the benches like wind through dry leaves, scattering certainty, reshaping the entire story in an instant. Reynolds went pale. His flush of anger drained from his face so fast it was almost frightening, leaving him gray and ashen. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands, which had gripped the stand with swagger just minutes earlier, now trembled visibly. The bailiff took a step forward, his instincts pulling him toward the badge. Another step, slower this time, his hand half raised as if unsure whether to pick it up or salute it. But Danielle beat him to it. Calmly, deliberately, she bent down, lifted the badge with 2 fingers, and placed it back on the table in front of her. She didn't wave it. She didn't flaunt it. She simply set it there, face up, as if returning a heart to its rightful chest. Then she rose. For the first time that day, her silence broke in more than fragments. Her voice was cool, measured, unhurried. "I wasn't here to defend myself," she said softly, each word carrying weight that settled into the bones of the room. "I was here to expose you." The gallery flinched as one body. Some gasped. Some whispered prayers under their breath. A man in the back muttered, "Lord, have mercy." Even Judge Whitman, who had so easily dismissed her earlier, sat back in his chair, his face suddenly drawn, his authority wobbling beneath the realization of what stood in front of him. Reynolds tried to recover, but swagger was no longer an option. This is a trick," he stammered. His voice shook, ragged and raw. "Anybody can carry a fake badge." But no one believed him. His denial sounded hollow, desperate, like the last breath of a man drowning in the lies he had told. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply placed her hand gently over the badge, as if protecting it, and looked directly at the judge. "My presence in this courtroom is not an accident, and neither is his." She didn't point at Reynolds. She didn't need to. Every eye followed her gaze, drawing the line for her. The judge rubbed the bridge of his nose, his hand trembling slightly. His voice, when it came, was strained. "Miss Carter, explain to this court the nature of your affiliation." Danielle's reply was precise, firm. "I can't speak to operations, but I can say this truth does not require your permission." The gallery erupted again. Some were whispering furiously, others staring wide-eyed at her with newfound awe. The narrative they had swallowed whole just hours earlier, crooked attorney caught red-handed, was unraveling in real time. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, and condemned was standing revealed as something else entirely, an operative of the United States government. The prosecutor, pale and sweating, rose quickly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he protested, his voice breaking. "The state was not informed." Danielle turned her head, her eyes catching him in the corner of her gaze. Her words cut him off before he could finish. "Truth doesn't ask for permission." And the room fell quiet again. That was the moment the tide turned completely. The swagger of a white officer had collapsed. The mask of prejudice had slipped. And the silence of a black woman, underestimated and mocked, had revealed itself as the most powerful weapon in the room. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a badge, sliding across the floor at exactly the right moment, exposing lies no one wanted to see. And that revelation was only the beginning, because the next step through those double doors would make everything official. 3 men in dark suits, followed by 2 more, would enter the courtroom. Their movements crisp, unhurried. Their credentials are undeniable. And the truth about Danielle Carter would no longer be a whisper. It would be a declaration. There are moments when a room forgets how to breathe. The Crestwood courtroom was already stunned by the sight of Danielle Carter's badge lying face-up on the defense table. But the real turning point came with the sound of the double doors opening. It wasn't loud, just the creak of hinges and the soft thud of polished shoes against the wooden floor. But the sound carried like thunder through the silence. Heads turned as one. The gallery craned forward, and then we saw them. 5 men in dark suits entered, 3 in front and 2 trailing behind. Their movements were crisp, measured, not hurried, not theatrical, just certain. These were not small-town officials. These were federal agents. They carried themselves with the calm gravity of men who didn't need to prove their authority because their very presence did it for them. The lead agent was tall, early 40s, clean-cut, his expression composed. He carried no swagger, no smirk. Instead, he radiated something steadier, control. His badge flashed briefly as he approached the bench. When he spoke, his voice was even, no louder than necessary. "Your Honor," he said, "for the limited purpose of these proceedings, Miss Danielle Carter's credentials are authentic. She is operating in coordination with federal authorities. The word authentic rippled through the room like a warm front colliding with cold ground. It moved face to face, bench to bench, replacing smug certainty with stunned recalculation. The gallery had entered the courthouse expecting a spectacle of guilt. Now they sat, watching their assumptions collapse. Judge Harold Whitman leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the armrest as if steadying himself against the blow. His glasses slid down his nose, and when he pushed them back up, his hand trembled slightly. The man who had once called Danielle a disgrace to his court now looked like a schoolboy caught reciting the wrong lesson. Officer Reynolds lurched to his feet. His chair screeched backward across the floor, a raw, ugly sound. "This is outrageous," he shouted, his voice cracking. His face was pale now, drained of the earlier flush of anger. "She planted that badge. She's making a mockery of this court." Two of the agents moved in unison, their steps quiet but firm. They flanked Reynolds with the precision of men who had done this 1,000 times. Their hands were polite, but there was no mistaking the steel in their touch. A metallic click echoed through the chamber. Then another, handcuffs. The sound was sharp, terrible, final. Reynolds flinched, not at the hands gripping his wrists, but at the noise itself. The sound of metal closing around him was the sound of authority leaving his body, the sound of the swagger collapsing into chains. The gallery gasped. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. And a few, those who had cheered him earlier, sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the officer they admired with the man now shackled before them. Reynolds struggled weakly, his voice rising in desperation. She set this up. You don't understand. I'm the officer here. I've served this county for 20 years. His pleas cracked like glass under strain, but no one was nodding anymore. His words, once so heavy with confidence, now sounded hollow, pitiful. Danielle rose slowly from her seat. She didn't look at the gallery, or the judge, or even Reynolds. She looked forward, her face calm, her shoulders straight. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost gentle. "Justice doesn't scream," she said. "It just arrives." The words landed like a blessing. The court reporter, who had been typing furiously all morning, lifted her eyes for the first time, as if needing to see the words before she could record them. Judge Whitman bowed his head, just slightly, the movement almost imperceptible. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, the first small sign that his certainty had cracked. Agent Thomas Blake, the lead, inclined his head toward Danielle, professional and precise. Then he turned back to the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "we request the court preserve all relevant materials and maintain Miss Carter's access as required." His tone was courteous, but it carried steel beneath it. No question now held authority in the room. The prosecutor, Patrick Sloan, rose shakily. His voice was pale, stripped of the swagger it had carried earlier. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Danielle turned her gaze toward him. She didn't interrupt with volume, only with presence. Her eyes, steady and sharp, cut through his words. And when she spoke, it was enough to silence him. "This court was mocked," she said, her tone even. "But not by me, by him." She didn't point at Reynolds. She didn't need to. The shackles spoke for themselves. The gallery shifted again. A man in the front row whispered, "Lord, help him." And for the first time, the him was not Danielle, it was Reynolds. Angela Moore sat in the gallery, tears glistening on her cheeks. She pressed both hands to her chest, her lips trembling in silent prayer. To her, this was more than justice for Danielle. It was redemption for every moment she had once stayed silent. Reynolds slumped in his chair, the metal cuffs digging into his wrists. The swagger he had worn so easily now looked like a costume torn apart. His face, once smug, was gray with defeat. His eyes darted desperately, looking for someone, anyone, to believe him. But there was no one left. Danielle returned to her seat. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply placed her hand over her badge and rested the other flat on the table. Her silence filled the room once more, but now it carried a different weight. It wasn't the silence of accusation. It was the silence of victory, not a loud, triumphant victory, but a steady, undeniable one. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, his voice quieter now, his authority humbled. "Let the record reflect," he said slowly, "that this court will correct its course." The words were not an apology. They were something harder, an admission that he had been wrong, that the truth had been stronger than his assumptions. The gallery whispered, the sound rising like a tide. She was right, someone murmured. All along. An elderly man near the front crossed himself. A woman whispered, "Justice at last." Danielle sat steady, her eyes forward. She didn't look at the whispers. She didn't need them. The truth was enough. The federal intervention had changed everything. The mask was gone. The swagger was gone. And in their place stood a new story, the story of a black woman who had been mocked, doubted, accused, and yet had turned the courtroom upside down with nothing but silence, dignity, and truth. But this was not the final page, because once the doors of the courthouse opened again, the world outside would demand answers. Cameras, reporters, and questions shouted like bullets. And Danielle would face them the same way she had faced the courtroom. Steady, silent, untouchable.